Here's the rewritten version with approximately 15% changes using synonyms and altered names while maintaining similar length and adding more paragraph breaks. In 1989, a prominent Memphis entrepreneur was buried after physicians determined he had succumbed to cardiac failure. His grandson received an inheritance of $1.3 million, and the matter was discreetly concluded as yet another natural passing in a municipal hospital. However, years afterward, a solitary discrepancy concealed within the hospital's documentation compelled authorities to revisit the file. What they discovered was far more than an error. It was the exposure of a concealed plot that transformed a family loss into one of the city's most disturbing homicide investigations. In 1989, 78-year-old Harold Peterson was brought to Memorial Hospital with a diagnosis of congestive heart failure. His medical background revealed years of cardiac complications, including instances of fluid accumulation, exhaustion, and difficulty breathing. Notwithstanding these ailments, his physicians characterized him as stable. Medical care was continuing, and there was no suggestion that his situation was urgently critical. Harold Peterson was far from just another aging patient. He was a widower and an individual who had amassed a considerable fortune through decades of labor as a modest entrepreneur and real estate investor. His possessions consisted of numerous residential properties, land parcels, and various accounts in regional banks. The aggregate worth of his holdings was calculated at $1.3 million, a substantial sum in 1989. After the deaths of his son and daughter-in-law in an automobile collision years prior, Harold had assumed complete custody of his sole grandson, Marcus Peterson. Harold had furnished housing, monetary assistance, and schooling for Marcus, nurturing him as his own offspring. It was widely known that Marcus was the exclusive beneficiary to Harold's fortune. During Harold's hospitalization, Marcus made frequent visits. Personnel witnessed him at his grandfather's side and documented his attendance during physician consultations. To the hospital workers, his participation indicated a devoted grandson overseeing the treatment of an elderly family member. Before we continue further, share in the comments your location. We'd appreciate hearing from you, and remember to press that subscribe button so you don't miss our future videos. To external observers, the family relationship seemed normal. Harold was approaching life's end due to persistent illness, and Marcus, as beneficiary, was readying himself for an unavoidable change. Roughly 3 weeks following admission, Harold's state deteriorated abruptly. During the evening shift, with nurse Rebecca Thompson assigned to his section, Harold suffered a critical cardiac incident. Medical documentation recorded an acute decline that proved irreversible. Despite emergency procedures, he was declared deceased in the early morning hours. The supervising doctors determined that the cause of death was complications from chronic cardiac disease. The reasoning aligned with his medical background and his elderly status. No abnormalities were officially documented at that moment, and no challenges were presented by family members. The death certificate indicated natural causes, and the hospital terminated the case without additional examination. Memorial services were conducted swiftly. Family members and acquaintances gathered, and no protests were voiced regarding the official cause of death. Witnesses characterized Marcus as noticeably grief-stricken, displaying the appearance of a young man lamenting the departure of the sole guardian he had recognized since youth. Judicial processes concerning the estate commenced shortly following the memorial. Probate papers verified that Harold's testament bequeathed all possessions to Marcus Peterson. Within weeks, real estate deeds, financial holdings, and property records were reassigned. The complete inheritance totaled $1.3 million, establishing Marcus as the singular recipient of Harold's lifelong accumulated prosperity. At the termination of these formalities, there seemed to be no outstanding questions. An elderly individual with a documented heart ailment had expired under medical observation, and his rightful heir had received the estate without challenge. To the community, this was a resolved affair. The blend of Harold's age, his chronic ailment, and the lack of other heirs formed a simple case with no indicators of abnormality. The hospital documentation was stored, the legal papers archived, and the situation deemed concluded. For those immediately concerned, the chain of circumstances appeared reasonable: a natural passing, a standard inheritance, and no cause to re-examine the case. Nevertheless, the details of that particular evening in 1989, which seemed unremarkable at the time, would not stay undisturbed. Years subsequently, those identical records would undergo review once more, and what previously resembled the expected conclusion of a chronic condition would be re-evaluated. At the decade's end, authorities would commence questioning whether Harold Peterson's death had genuinely been natural, or whether the $1.3 million estate he left behind had been hastened through human involvement. In 1994, 5 years following the death of Harold Peterson, Memorial Hospital in Memphis experienced a leadership transition. With fresh administrators arrived new protocols, and among their initial objectives was to execute a comprehensive audit of the hospital's documentation. This was standard procedure. When administration changed, it was customary practice to examine medication records, accounting files, and patient charts to guarantee adherence and precision. The objective was to create organization, to validate that no inconsistencies had gathered over the years. The examination procedure was thorough. Thousands of document pages were retrieved from archives, encompassing admissions, medical records, prescription directives, and pharmaceutical logs. Most instances were standard, containing expected documentation that corresponded between doctors' instructions, nurse annotations, and pharmacy distribution records. However, within the ocean of documentation, one file emerged as unusual. It was the case of Harold Peterson, the 78-year-old patient who had expired during spring 1989. The anomaly surfaced in the comparison between pharmacy distribution slips and the physician's documented prescriptions. A pharmaceutical record indicated that on the evening of Harold Peterson's death, a dosage of a powerful heart medication had been dispensed to the ward. Nevertheless, when auditors verified the doctor's directives, no documentation of such a prescription was present. The supervising physician had not sanctioned that specific drug for Peterson's care. The inconsistency intensified when his medical record was reviewed. In the patient's documentation, there was an entry verifying that the medication had been given, and adjacent to that entry was the handwritten signature of the duty nurse, Rebecca Thompson. From a management standpoint, this exceeded a trivial administrative mistake. It was a substantial irregularity. Medication could not lawfully be given without a doctor's authorization, and pharmaceutical inventory could not be allocated beyond approved prescriptions. The finding generated two scenarios. Either a grave violation of protocol had occurred through carelessness, or someone had purposely circumvented the medical strategy. For the hospital's fresh management, permitting such matters to remain unaddressed was intolerable. Every element of the case indicated that appropriate procedures had been disregarded. If it had been an accident, it was a severe one. If it had been deliberate, it was conceivably illegal. The papers retained in official archives presented definite proof of a mismatch between what was prescribed, what was furnished, and what was entered in the patient's record. The administration gathered the pertinent documents, including duplicates of the pharmacy slips, the physician's instructions, and the patient's record. These were subsequently forwarded to the Memphis Police Department for additional investigation. What commenced as an internal initiative to establish accountability in the hospital's records now suggested a potential criminal offense. For authorities, the consequences were instantaneous. Harold Peterson's death in 1989 had been regarded as natural, attributed to complications of chronic cardiac disease. The official documentation from that period had reinforced that determination, and no objections were voiced. However, the new proof suggested an alternative situation. If a medication had been introduced without permission, and if its administration had been masked within the medical record, then the likelihood of external manipulation had to be evaluated. The primary question transformed into whether this irregularity constituted unintentional malpractice or purposeful misconduct. A nurse had authenticated the drug's delivery, yet no doctor had prescribed it. Pharmaceutical records confirmed that the drug had been issued, signifying the documentation corresponded on that aspect. Solely the physician's orders failed to align. The discrepancy could not be excused as a misplaced document or a forgotten notation. It was a recorded contradiction maintained in the hospital's personal files. With the evidence transferred to law enforcement, an aged case that had been terminated for 5 years returned to official examination. A death that had previously appeared routine was redesignated as questionable. The attention shifted unavoidably to the nurse, whose identity surfaced in the documentation. Rebecca Thompson, identified as the accountable individual for delivering the drug, now positioned at the focal point of inquiries surrounding Harold Peterson's final moments. Investigators commenced by piecing together her work record. Hospital files substantiated that she had departed suddenly within weeks of Peterson's death in 1989. There had been no official grievance or punitive measure against her at that juncture, yet her exit had been unexpected and absolute. She not merely departed Memorial Hospital, but failed to persist in the identical hospital system. To authorities examining the file, this information was noteworthy. A healthcare worker who had functioned steadily in the same facility elected to depart immediately following a patient's unanticipated death, and that death now possessed recorded abnormalities in care. Authorities requisitioned financial data and background investigations spanning the months subsequent to her departure. What surfaced strengthened their apprehensions. During summer 1989, Thompson acquired a complete collection of new furnishings from a regional merchant, the category of expenditure that demanded payment substantially beyond her monthly compensation as a nurse. At practically the identical period, she organized tuition for her daughter at a Memphis region university, submitting a considerable payment. Neither of these transactions could be clarified by her standard earnings. Her compensation from Memorial Hospital, as verified in payroll documentation, had been humble and steady. The abrupt elevation in expenditure suggested that she had secured funds from a different source immediately following Peterson's death. The authorities now possessed two segments of proof that, when examined collectively, generated significant questions. Firstly, her signature surfaced in Harold Peterson's record, substantiating delivery of a heart medication never prescribed by the attending doctor. Secondly, she exhibited inexplicable financial transactions almost instantly after departing the hospital. The chronology linked both occurrences intimately to the death of Harold Peterson. Authorities pondered whether this could be rationalized as carelessness succeeded by happenstance, but the situation appeared improbable. A nurse mistakenly delivering medication without clearance might be conceivable. However, executing this on the precise evening the patient expired, departing within weeks, and subsequently expending remarkably substantial sums of money established a configuration that was difficult to overlook. At this juncture, authorities did not yet comprehend why Thompson would have executed such an action or who might have supported her conduct. What they did comprehend was that she seemed to be the principal figure in the unexplained components of the case. The records connected her to a judgment that should not have transpired under hospital regulations. The financial documentation connected her to assets she should not have possessed. Investigators assembled a file with these discoveries. It encompassed duplicates of the pharmaceutical records, the doctor's directives, the patient record authenticated by Thompson, her departure documents from Memorial Hospital, and documentation of her acquisitions and tuition transactions. This assemblage of proof established a profile of a nurse who possessed both the chance and prospective motivation to interfere in Harold Peterson's care. The subsequent action was evident. Authorities required confronting Thompson immediately. Without her clarification, the proof stayed circumstantial. Her identity in the documentation was irrefutable. But solely she could justify why the medication was delivered, why she abandoned her position, and how she managed to finance abrupt expenditures in the months that succeeded. By the conclusion of 1994, the inquiry had transitioned from the broad question of whether Peterson's death had been natural to the particular question of what function Thompson had executed in it. The case that formerly resembled an unavoidable medical occurrence was now connected to one person whose judgments seemed incompatible with medical guidelines and financial circumstances. The probe was no longer regarding general irregularities in the hospital's records. It was now concentrated on the nurse who had been with Harold Peterson in the closing moments of his existence. Locating Rebecca Thompson demanded more than simply accessing an archived file. By 1994, 5 years had elapsed since she had withdrawn from Memorial Hospital, and her whereabouts in the interim were dispersed across western Tennessee. Authorities initiated with her nursing credential, which had stayed current, and from that point reconstructed her work background. They discovered that Thompson had not remained extended in one location after departing Memphis. In late 1989, she enrolled for provisional assignments via a staffing organization, occupying brief nursing positions at multiple facilities. Compensation records obtained from those establishments revealed irregular work with interruptions that complicated establishing her whereabouts at specific periods. Investigators subsequently scrutinized public documentation, service bills, registration records, and automobile registrations to bridge those interruptions. The evidence demonstrated that Thompson had modified addresses thrice in equally numerous years, each relocation transporting her more distant from Memphis. In 1990, she resided several months in Collierville. By 1991, she had transferred to Jackson, Tennessee, where she ultimately obtained a stable position at a recovery facility. It was the initial occasion since departing Memorial that her employment record seemed consistent. Staff documentation from the facility characterized her as reliable and skilled, but associates informed authorities that she evaded inquiries regarding her previous work and maintained her private existence protected. The movement configuration indicated a conscious effort to begin anew. Previous colleagues in Memphis recalled her exit as hasty, without adequate justification, and observed that she had not preserved communication with them subsequently. For investigators, this contributed to the perception that she had desired to disconnect associations with her history. By the moment authorities validated her location in Jackson, they had compiled a definite documentation of her activities since 1989. They understood where she had resided, where she had labored, and how rapidly she had progressed from her role at Memorial Hospital. The configuration of regular movements succeeded by ultimate consistency, and Jackson provided investigators certainty that they had located the correct individual. With her present work authenticated and her location confirmed, the following action was inescapable. Thompson would be requested for interrogation to clarify her conduct on the evening Harold Peterson expired. When investigators interrogated Rebecca Thompson, she originally refuted any misconduct. She reiterated that she had adhered to hospital protocols and documented medications following standard procedure. However, when authorities positioned the pharmaceutical slip and her authenticated record entry before her, alongside receipts displaying costly furnishings and tuition transactions executed merely weeks following her departure, her stance deteriorated. Under persistent interrogation, Thompson acknowledged the reality. She declared that during Harold Peterson's concluding weeks in the hospital, Marcus and Jennifer approached her immediately. Per her statement, They offered her $3,000 in currency if she delivered and supplementary dosage of heart medication to Harold during one of her evening duties. The funds were transferred to her in an envelope in the hospital parking area. 2 evenings before Harold expired, Thompson verified that she accepted the envelope, executed the injection, and modified the record to make the dosage seem standard. Thompson's personal family was incorporated into the scenario. Her daughter, who had been a university student in the early 1990s, discovered during the investigation that the tuition transactions funding her schooling had been traced to funds obtained in 1989. Authorities substantiated that the chronology corresponded with the currency Thompson confessed, accepting from the Peterson couple. For the daughter, this revelation was crushing. She had perpetually assumed her mother's devotion and additional duties had financed her education. Alternatively, she now had to address the actuality that her education had been funded by funds associated with a man's demise. Authorities documented that she seemed collaborative during conversations, but profoundly disturbed by the notion that her prospects were linked to a criminal act. This dimension of the case introduced another stratum of intricacy, demonstrating how the consequences of a hidden homicide reached beyond the direct offenders and into the existences of those who had unwittingly gained. With this confession, authorities possessed a definite accusation, but they required autonomous verification. A confession exclusively was inadequate to present a case to trial. Investigators directed attention to financial documentation to determine whether Marcus and Jennifer could have accumulated $3,000 in 1989. The initial phase was to examine the couple's financial accounts and commercial records. No abnormal withdrawals surfaced, and no payments were composed that corresponded with the schedule Thompson outlined. Concentration then moved to prospective sources of immediate currency. Investigators verified whether valuables had been disposed of or committed during that spring. At a Memphis pawnbroker, the investigation yielded a notable discovery. In a register dated May 10th, precisely 1 week preceding Harold's demise, a gold ring with engraved characters was documented as disposed for $450. The vendor's identity was registered as Jennifer Peterson, and her authentication was maintained on the document. This record furnished a straightforward link between the couple and currency accumulated days preceding the hospital occurrence. Authorities then referenced records maintained by the Department of Motor Vehicles. The files substantiated that on May 6th, merely days preceding the pawnbroker transaction, Marcus had disposed of his aged sedan. The DMV preserved the ownership transfer and a purchaser-authenticated receipt verifying a transaction of $2,300 in currency. Collectively, the two dealings represented approximately $2,750, intimately corresponding with the sum Thompson characterized obtaining in the envelope. When authorities positioned these discoveries alongside Thompson's admission, the components synchronized. The couple had converted personal possessions in a concentrated time frame, accumulated nearly $3,000, and furnished those resources to Thompson in return for her delivering a fatal dosage. Thompson's abrupt capacity to compensate for furnishings and tuition instantly subsequently fulfilled the sequence. By the termination of this segment of the probe, investigators no longer depended on suspicion or declaration exclusively. They possessed a confession from the nurse, substantiated by verified financial dealings. The inheritance of $1.3 million provided Marcus and Jennifer their incentive. The pawnbroker and DMV documentation demonstrated their resources. The envelope of currency outlined by Thompson clarified her function. The probe had now confirmed both the deed and the coordination supporting it. What had formerly been acknowledged as the natural demise of an elderly individual was rebuilt as the deliberate utilization of funds to acquire silence and participation. And for the initial occasion, Marcus and Jennifer Peterson positioned not as mourning family, but as identified suspects in a homicide-for-profit case. With Thompson's admission obtained, authorities redirected their concentration to Marcus and Jennifer Peterson. In 1989, Marcus was 27 and his spouse 25. They functioned a modest family enterprise, but documentation demonstrated it produced solely moderate income and frequently depended on Harold Peterson's monetary assistance to survive. They possessed limited possessions of worth, and their reserves were minimal. Multiple of Harold's commercial associates subsequently informed investigators that he had developed exasperated with his grandson's reliance and had transparently declined to furnish capital for the venture concepts Marcus advocated. Harold favored to retain authority over his property holdings, abandoning Marcus without accessibility to substantial resources until the period of inheritance. When investigators transported the couple for interrogation, both resolutely refuted Thompson's account of circumstances. They characterized her admission as an action of self-protection, formulated to transfer accountability from herself. Marcus rejected the automobile transaction as happenstance, and Jennifer maintained she had committed her ring from requirement. They persisted to assert Harold's demise had been natural. Nevertheless, the papers substantiated that in the days preceding his concluding hospitalization, they had accumulated nearly $3,000 in currency. The probe then broadened to the duration following Harold's demise. Investigators examined the couple's monetary conduct in the months that succeeded. Financial documentation demonstrated that within a year of obtaining the $1.3 million inheritance, Marcus acquired a residence in a more prosperous Memphis district with a considerable currency initial payment. Tourism organizations furnished receipts substantiating that the couple traveled in Florida during summer 1990, and merchants verified their acquisitions of exclusive apparel and premium household merchandise. These expenditures designated a dramatic comparison to the humble existence they had experienced preceding Harold's demise. Witness declaration reinforced the monetary representation. A previous worker of Harold Peterson reported that Harold had articulated regarding his grandson's restlessness and his rejection of the enterprises Marcus aspired to undertake. Nevertheless, fewer than 2 years following Harold's demise, Marcus contributed portion of his inheritance into a regional real estate development program, and prospect he could never have obtained while his grandfather was living. The venture yielded revenue, supplementing to the proof that Harold's departure revealed opportunities that had previously been sealed. From these discoveries, authorities reconstructed the chain with exactness. Marcus and Jennifer, youthful and monetarily limited, determined not to anticipate Harold's condition to progress naturally. They accumulated $2,750 in currency by committing Jennifer's engraved ring and disposing Marcus's automobile, and they transferred the funds to Thompson in an envelope in the parking area of Memorial Hospital. 2 evenings subsequently, Thompson executed her function. She injected Harold with an unauthorized dosage of heart medication, modified the record to conceal her conduct, and abandoned the demise to seem as the natural conclusion of an extended condition. The succeeding morning, Harold was pronounced deceased, and within weeks his holdings transferred completely to Marcus. The comprehensive context substantiated the incentive: the couple's monetary desperation, their dependence on Harold, his opposition to supporting their enterprises, and their abrupt elevation in prosperity, all indicated in the identical trajectory. Thompson's admission corresponded with the schedule of the possession transactions and the lifestyle modifications that succeeded. The representation that materialized was not of happenstance, but of a premeditated action that converted a struggling youthful couple into the recipients of a fortune. For 6 years, Harold Peterson's demise had been acknowledged as natural, the silent termination of a persistent condition. By 1994, authorities had revealed it as something completely dissimilar. Through declaration, documentation, and monetary examination, the reality was rebuilt. Harold had not merely expired, he had been purposely propelled toward demise by those who positioned to benefit the greatest. By 1995, the discoveries of the resumed probe reached the Shelby County judicial system. What had commenced with an inconsistency in a hospital documentation had expanded into a case reinforced by stratums of proof. Prosecutors approached the courtroom with a rigorously assembled file that incorporated hospital records, pharmaceutical slips, pawnbroker registers, DMV transfer papers, and the authenticated declaration of Rebecca Thompson. Each segment linked to the subsequent, establishing a sequence that prosecutors contended could not be fractured. The proceedings attracted substantial consideration in Memphis. Harold Peterson had been a valued figure in commerce, and the disclosure that his demise was not natural but coordinated for monetary benefit astonished the community. The courtroom formalities commenced with the prosecution establishing a definite chronology. They outlined how Marcus and Jennifer Peterson converted possessions in early May 1989, accumulating nearly $3,000 in currency. They clarified how Thompson obtained that funds, delivered an unauthorized injection, and masked her conduct in Harold Peterson's record. Within moments, he was deceased, and within weeks, Marcus had received an estate valued $1.3 million. Protection lawyers responded by endeavoring to undermine Thompson. They contended that she was the exclusive perpetrator, constructing her account to diminish her penalty. They maintained that Marcus and Jennifer had been unjustly accused and that the pawnbroker and DMV documentation constituted nothing beyond standard monetary dealings. They indicated to Thompson's criminal accountability and encouraged the jury not to believe her testimony. However, prosecutors had predicted this protection. They displayed the pawnbroker register demonstrating Jennifer's authentication, the DMV transfer papers substantiating the transaction of Marcus's automobile, and documentation of Thompson's abrupt expenditure increase. Jurors witnessed the correspondence of occurrences, the couple producing currency, Thompson obtaining resources, and instant acquisitions that surpassed her compensation. Thompson's admission was not positioned exclusively. It was reinforced by monetary verification, witness declarations, and the comprehensive configuration of conduct. The prosecution likewise emphasized incentive. Marcus had received every currency unit of his grandfather's holdings, a sum that modified his existence entirely. He and his spouse had transferred into a superior district, acquired premium merchandise, and contributed in real estate within 2 years of the demise. Witnesses declared that Harold Peterson had opposed providing his grandson capital during his existence, substantiating that the inheritance was the exclusive pathway for Marcus to attain prosperity. The prosecution contended that restlessness and prospect merged in 1989, producing the premeditated judgment to terminate Harold's existence. As the proceedings advanced, the magnitude of proof became evident. Jurors attended to declaration from hospital personnel regarding Thompson's accessibility to the patient, from pawnbroker workers regarding Jennifer's dealing, and from authorities who delineated the monetary pathway from the couple to Thompson. The account was steady and the chronology exact. By the moment concluding contentions terminated, the representation before the jury was not one of uncertainty, but of conspiracy executed with disturbing calculation. When the determination was presented, it abandoned no uncertainty. Marcus and Jennifer Peterson were determined guilty of coordinating the homicide of Harold Peterson for monetary benefit. The judge established life penalties without the prospect of release. The courtroom, occupied with spectators who had pursued the proceedings intensely, observed the instant a prolonged concealed criminal act ultimately obtained judgment. For Rebecca Thompson, the result was dissimilar. Her collaboration with authorities, incorporating her comprehensive admission, had been essential in resuming the case and demonstrating the sequence of circumstances. The tribunal recognized her function, but evaluated her contribution substantially. She obtained a penalty of 10 years in confinement. It was a settlement that proportioned her involvement in the criminal act with the reality that her declaration had enabled judgment achievable. The termination of the proceedings emphasized the importance of the most minor elements. A solitary inconsistency in pharmaceutical documentation, disregarded for 6 years, had activated the exposure of a meticulously masked strategy. What formerly seemed to be a natural demise in a hospital environment was disclosed as a homicide executed for $1.3 million. The proceedings demonstrated that even when years have elapsed, the reality can surface, and judgment can be presented with assurance.